Look, we cannot tell by merely thinking about matters or by consulting tradition or by consulting our own minds and conscience. We can't tell what the right course of action is. There's no way to know what the right course of action is until after a majority has acted. And then whatever the majority has done, that's the right course of action. Well, of course, if we accept this position, farewell to the idea of the rights of the individual. Farewell to the rights of minorities. If your team wins the election, well, you've won the ball game, pick up the marbles or whatever it is, and to the victor belongs the spoils. It is a truism that government is society's authorized agency to use coercion in certain specified situations in the effort to protect the life, liberty, and property of all persons in the society. Those who, ignoring this, simply go about saying there ought to be a law are advertising, when they say there ought to be a law, that they are unable to persuade people to adopt the ideas or the program they are preaching, so they're going to force them. Whenever we advocate a law to achieve a certain end, we must realize that the law in last resort situations will use force to herd people in that direction. Sergeant Shriver, one of the Kennedy son-in-laws some years ago, said, in a democracy, you don't compel people to do something unless you're sure they won't do it. Talked a little bit about the ethical code, the moral code, and it seems pretty obvious that if we want government and the law to serve a moral end, it must act within the moral law. And this moral code tells us that human life is sacred, that rightful property is an extension of the person, and that liberty is a necessity if a human person is to become what he has it in him to be. This moral code then supplies a definition of crime. Murder is a crime, theft is a crime. It's a crime to abridge any person's rightful liberty. It's the function of the government then, or the law's function in free society, in harmony with the moral code, is to use lawful force against people who violate the moral code, that is, who murder or steal or abridge any person's lawful freedom, to use the law against criminals in order that peaceful persons may go about their business. The use of lawful force in the interests of defending peaceful persons is at the polar opposite. It's the other end of the spectrum from the use of legal violence against peaceful people for any purpose the users of legal violence may concoct. The differences between defense or force used defensively and force used aggressively. People should not be forced into conformity with any social blueprint for the restructuring of society. The private plans of people should not be subordinated to some grandiose overall political or national plan. Government, which is the public power, should not be used by private persons for their private advantage. If the government were within bounds, Mr. Iacocca would never have had a chance going to Washington to get the taxpayers to bail him out. The people in Chrysler, management, workers, stockholders, became a faction using the public power for their private advantage. Government should never be used to protect people from themselves, as if they were little children. Now then you ask, what should the law do to people who are peaceful or simply minding their own business? The answer is the law should let them alone and punish any private individual who will not let somebody else alone. Now, letting people alone is not the same as doing nothing. Letting things and people alone is an acquired skill. Albert J. Nock, who edited the Freeman, most of you have a copy of the current issue of the Freeman. Albert J. Nock, a very unusual person, edited that journal in a different format back in the 1920s, from 1920 to 1924. He had some very bright people working with him on the Freeman, people like Van Wyck Brooks and Suzanne La Follette, Lewis Mumford, a number of others. When the magazine folded after 4 years, folded in 1924, and Nock left, someone said to him, "Albert, it's wonderful what you have done for these young people." And Nock said, "Nonsense. I've just let them alone." "Yes, Albert," said his friend, "but it would have been different if somebody else had been letting them alone." Letting people alone, letting things alone is a high art, an acquired skill and acquired taste. Well, our discussion has focused on the nature of government, and I think we realize, even if we hadn't done that, that the essence of government is power. Power politics is a redundancy. There's no politics without power involved. Power doesn't govern. Power is what is government. That's the political art. Now, once this truth sinks in, that we are dealing with legal or authorized legal force, once we take this step, we figure out the next step, which is to ask ourselves, what function within society can the use of legal force perform? And we realize, not much. Legal force can, if it's used effectively, apprehend and punish criminals, but legal force by itself cannot direct creative or productive activities of people. The function of the law to protect the life, liberty, and property of all persons, and that was the thesis of classical liberalism, and I buy it. Might say that the people who, back a couple of centuries ago, began to ponder the question, what is the proper scope and function of government, came up with an answer such as I've outlined. They were called first Whigs and then Liberals, and the answer given by classical liberalism and old-fashioned Whiggism is, let the law protect the life, liberty, and property of all persons alike, and let people be free in the vast domain of their personal lives outside the law. Now, there's a second question. Once you've resolved the first question of limiting government, there's a second question. Who's going to be the mayor? Or who's going to be the president? Or who's going to be the dog catcher? It's the choice of personnel. How do you choose people to occupy the office? 4 methods have come down to us historically. One is choice by bloodline. If the society is saturated with monarchical ideology, if everybody believes in monarchy, and there is a king, and if you are the oldest son, well, you'll be the king when the old man dies. And this can work out very well. It doesn't always work out, else what would Shakespeare have done for his plays? You know, sometimes your mother's lover will bump off the old man. Or on some other occasion, your kid brother will slip a knife under the 5th rib. But it can work, has worked. The second method, also choice by bloodline, is aristocracy. Venice had a council drawn from among the first 400 families. If your family is not one of the 400, forget it. Buy yourself a canoe and punt around the canals, or whatever they do on those canals. A third method, never very popular, but was used in Athens for a time to choose the judges. You draw lots. It's called sortilege. Sortilege, if you get the short straw, you've lost. You're the judge for the next 6 weeks, or whatever the term might be. There's a fourth method. It's the one I approve of, because it accords with our habits, our customs, our mores. It is voting. Lay down a few requirements for the privilege of exercising the franchise, set aside a particular place and time, a day, let people go to the polls and mark their X or pull the lever, and the fellow who gets the largest number of votes, he's your next mayor or president or whatever. Now, it's obvious that balloting is little more than a popularity contest. Substantive questions, philosophical questions, are not decided at the polls. It's a choice of John Smith or Richard Roe or whatever. I've often posed the question, who was the most politically powerful American in the 20th century? I'll give you my answer, Norman Thomas. Now, Norman Thomas, head of the Socialist Party, which, by the way, is not a party in the American sense of the term. It's a cadre of people designed to put across a certain point of view. Norman Thomas ran for the presidency of the USA in 1924, 28, 32, 36, 40, 44, and 48. The most votes he ever got was a mere handful, 800,000 plus a few. My contention is that Norman Thomas's quadrennial exercise of running for the presidency did not advance the cause of socialism one whit. But the cause of socialism was advanced because Norman Thomas and his party used propaganda and educational methods for the other 364 days of the year. That's where the ideology got into the mainstream, which enabled Norman Thomas in 1952 to make his famous statement, looking over the platforms in 1952 of both parties, Republican and Democratic, to say, I would never have dreamed, short of a socialist victory at the polls, that so many socialist planks would be in the platforms of the two major parties. They got there by educational methods. They didn't get there by the balloting process. The balloting followed the propaganda that went on day in and day out all throughout the year. So to use a method appropriate for dealing with this question, and therefore to deal with this question, is a vain thing. You don't decide political issues at the polls, you decide them wherever people experience the learning process. Now occasionally, once in a while, some learning takes place on our college campuses. A lot of learning takes place as we read the newspaper, or magazines, or books, or come to a seminar like this, or have a debate, give a talk, listen to a talk, write a pamphlet, read a pamphlet, talk to someone on the street corner, talk over the back fence. These are all educational arenas where learning takes place, gradually, little by little, to alter the course of popular thinking. Now, I say there's a second question in politics, not very important really, and the people who dealt with that question in the past couple of centuries said, monarchy, no. Aristocracy, no. Sortilege, no. Voting, see. So they said, let's vote for who will be the next mayor or governor or whatever. They didn't think in terms of using the second question and its proper technique of voting to deal with the first question. We began to confuse the categories, to think to use the method appropriate to the second question, which is democracy,